every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness.
We said this is going to change everything. This is going to overthrow American foreign policy. This movie is revolutionary. We were completely wrong, but we really felt that something amazing had happened on the screen. It was radical and fresh for its time.
I think one of the great lines in the movie is,
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
you know, that's not permitted. We can destroy the world, but we can't fight in the war room.
Stanley had a strong feeling that there was a great possibility that there could be an accident, there could be an overthrow of Russia, that some maniac might start World War III.
Now, I want you to transmit Plan R for Robert, to the wing. Plan R for Robert.
Is it that bad, sir?
Looks like it's pretty hairy.
Yes, sir.
Stanley is the type of a person that when he takes an interest in something, he learns all about it and eventually becomes as astute and as knowledgeable about that subject as people who are professionals in that area. So that's an example of what you said, that people thought of Stanley as having an obsession about a subject and therefore leading to the making of a film.
Released in 1964, Dr. Strangelove is and remains a politically significant and relevant film. It was not, however, born in a vacuum or in the nether regions of a writer's imagination. The apocalyptic events portrayed are a clear and present byproduct of dangerous times.
Oh, hell. All the Russians above, sir?
During the 7 years I was secretary, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, we were facing the threat of Soviet movement against the West in some fashion that we might have to respond to with military action. And I'll give you an illustration. In September of 1961, a few months after President Kennedy had been inaugurated, the Soviets tried to take West Berlin away from NATO. At the end of World War II, Berlin, which was in the East German bloc, which was controlled by the Soviets, had been split in two parts, East and West. The eastern part was under the control of the Soviets. The western part was under control of NATO. And in September or October of 61, the Soviets sought to take West Berlin and incorporate it in the Soviet sector. We couldn't possibly accept that. And therefore, I won't go into the details, but therefore we responded, trying to avoid military action, but very quickly having to add to our supply convoys that were crossing East Germany a military escort. And then the Soviets instructed the East Germans to prevent a militarily escorted NATO convoy from crossing East Germany that we had a right to cross to supply West Berlin from doing so. And at that point, I called General Norstad, who was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, to Washington and said, look, Larry, they did A, we did B, they did C, we did D. How's this going to evolve? He said, well, they'll do E, we'll do F, they'll do G. And I said, what do you do then? He said, well, I guess we'll have to use nuclear weapons. Now, that was September 1961. That's not Cold War, that's close to hot war.
Dr. Strangelove was not a movie, but a metaphor for the reality of this time, which to me was not an abstraction. And McNamara is right, it was hot. It was so hot. We don't realize how hot it was.
What scared me was the threat that the world was going to end.
And we read in Life magazine about building a bomb shelter in the backyard, and my dad refused to build a bomb shelter on the grounds that if everybody was going to die, what would be the use of surviving?
And we had those drills about get under your desk because the bomb is coming, because the Soviet Union is going to attack.
We hide on the desk like that was going to keep us. A little metal and wood desk that was going to keep us keep us safe from atomic and nuclear bombs. But that's what we were told.
It was always present and dangerous as hell. You know, maybe it was a kind of hell.
In order to guard against surprise nuclear attack, America's Strategic Air Command maintains a large force of B-52 bombers airborne 24 hours a day. Each B-52 can deliver a nuclear bomb load of 50 megatons, equal to 16 times the total explosive force of all the bombs and shells used by all the armies in World War II. Based in America, the Airborne Alert Force is deployed from the Persian Gulf to the Arctic Ocean, but they have one geographical factor in common. They are all 2 hours from their targets inside Russia.
Americans and Soviets were, in equal measure, living with daily doses of fear, paranoia, and macho warmongering. To survive, a common strategy was launched to keep the other side at bay.
Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack.
In the late 50s and the early 60s, the Soviets built up a very large conventional military force, that is to say, a military force without nuclear weapons, in Europe. They had been putting political pressure and other pressures on the West, and the presumption was that at some point they might use that large conventional military force to attack Western Europe. And the U.S. forces that were stationed there to help protect Western Europe. And therefore, the U.S. had adopted a policy under the Eisenhower administration of deterrence. Some called it a big bang for a buck, meaning that NATO believed, rightly or wrongly, that it could not develop a conventional force sufficiently strong to deter the initiation of a conventional military attack by the Soviets against NATO. And the only way that attack could be prevented, the attack by a Soviet conventional force, would be for NATO to acquire nuclear weapons using the U.S. forces to confront a Warsaw Pact conventional attack with a nuclear response. That was NATO's stated policy at the time. And it was done in order to lead the Soviets to conclude they should never initiate a conventional attack. That's what was called the deterrent policy. The deterrent policy involved confronting a Warsaw Pact conventional attack with a nuclear response that would be so great as to inflict unacceptable damage on the Warsaw Pact, and therefore lead them to conclude ahead of time they should never initiate.
How much of a nuclear deterrent is it if we're all deterred by being killed, so nobody is left alive? In that case, what have we actually deterred?
Nuclear deterrence did not make sense, but what was the alternative? And seeing there were none, it seemed to make sense.
The titanic buildup of devastating weaponry, known as the arms race, continued for decades, nearly bankrupting treasuries and diverting resources from more beneficial pursuits. Events, claimed many observers, were rapidly spinning out of control.
For more than a year, ominous rumors had been privately circulating among high-level Western leaders that the Soviet Union had been at work on what was darkly hinted to be the ultimate weapon, a doomsday device.
The doomsday machine? What is that? A device which will destroy all human and animal life on Earth.
All human and animal life?
The hypothetical doomsday machine in the movie? Well, you know, people talked about that seriously.
Afraid I don't understand something, Alexei. Is the Premier threatening to explode this if our planes carry out their attack?
No, sir. It is not a thing a sane man would do. The doomsday machine is designed to trigger itself automatically.
But surely you can disarm it somehow?
No, it is designed to explode if any attempt is ever made to untrigger it.
Automatically?
It's an obvious commie trick, Mr. President. We're wasting valuable time. Look at the big boy. They're getting ready to clobber us.
In a sense, though we literally didn't have it, the whole system amounted to that, didn't it?
He's not adequate in his sexual life. And there's always been this theory, correlation between, penis and the gun and the bomb. So if you're not getting none, you're more apt to be a warmonger.
Mr. President, about 35 minutes ago, General Jack Ripper, the commanding general of Burleson Air Force Base, issued an order to the 34 B-52s of his wing, which were airborne at the time, as part of a special exercise we were holding called Operation Dropkick. Now, it appears that the order called for the planes to attack their targets inside Russia. The planes are fully armed with nuclear weapons with an average load of 40 megatons each.
I think we're always close because of an accident, a mistake, somebody crazy in the system. And it's astonishing we didn't blow ourselves up, that there wasn't one glitch in the system, one crazy General Ripper that would have done something.
General Turgidson, I find this very difficult to understand. I was under the impression that I was the only one in authority to order the use of nuclear weapons.
That's right, sir. You are the only person authorized to do so. And although I hate to judge before all the facts are in, it's beginning to look like General Ripper exceeded his authority.
There are various kinds of accidents that could happen. Misunderstanding of commands, misjudgment, miscalculations about dangers, misreading of information that a Soviet attack was underway. We had many false radar readings and other readings of Soviet attacks caused by a host of phenomenon, physical and other phenomenon. So there was always that danger that what we thought was a Soviet attack, which we would wish to respond to before it landed. The Soviet missiles took roughly 30 minutes to fly from Soviet Union to the US, and we believed we would have warning after about 15 minutes of flight, and therefore we would have 15 minutes to launch. And today, we have something on the order of 6,000 strategic warheads, of which roughly 2,000 are deployed ready to launch on 15 minutes. And you may have a misreading of what's happening, and that's one of the greatest dangers.
It started with Stanley saying that he had come across this book by Peter George, which was everything that you could want in a great suspense, dramatic presentation of the thermonuclear dilemma. We were convinced that we had a very exciting piece. We actually took some trade ads that was going to be our next picture.
Clearly, the Cold War and the possibility of a nuclear accident and retaliation were no laughing matter, except to Stanley Kubrick.
We had kidded around when it got late at night when we were playing around with the serious screenplay about what would it be like if this thing was a comedy. And we would have lots of laughs about the humor that's sort of inherent in this situation. But we felt we had a good thing in a serious picture, and we thought we better not mess with don't get off a winner.
Shortly after helping to secure financing for the film, James Harris, with Kubrick's blessing, left the partnership to pursue a directing career of his own. Kubrick began to attack the script from a provocative angle.
I don't like the look of this, Fred.
It wasn't long after where Stanley called me and he said, "You remember we talked about the possibility of doing this as a comedy?" And my heart sunk, you know, because I really felt that leave Stanley alone for 10 minutes and that he's going to ruin his career and he's going to make a terrible mistake. I mean, this is what I really felt, is that now I start really feeling guilty that I should never have left, look, I mean, my God, supposing this thing turns out to be like a catastrophe.
That is precisely the idea, General. That is precisely the idea.
You know, Stanley told me that he couldn't think of a better way to express the whole thermonuclear dilemma, that it was so crazy and it was so insane, that the best way to do it would be as a satire.
The Air Force hated this whole story, and hated the results of this movie, too.
I'm beginning to smell a big, fat, commie rat.
It's not just sort of satirical. It is outrageous.
Now then, Dmitri, you know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb.
I don't think it's too important to really decide if it's a satire or just a black comedy. It's a little bit of both. And it's also just sort of a story out of the headlines rotated in the direction of the inevitable logic of stories like that. If you have machines that can set the end of the world into motion and cannot be called back, then that's a fact, whether it's funny or not. And in this movie, it's kind of funny and it's kind of not.
Films like that really, even though I wasn't aware of it though, subconsciously told me that you could have serious subject matter and at the same time inject humor in it.
You ought to see it sometime. It's a sight. A big plane like a 52 room. It's jet exhaust frying chickens in the barnyard.
Yeah, but has he got a chance?
Has he got a chance? Hell,
I know it might be a cliche, you know, you sugarcoat the pill, but I think it works like that.
Major Kong, is it possible this is some kind of loyalty test, you know? Give the go code and then recall to see who would actually go?
Ain't nobody ever got the go code yet. And old Ripper wouldn't be giving us Plan R unless them Ruskies had already clobbered Washington and a lot of other towns with a sneak attack.
Yes, sir.
Well, boys, I reckon this is it. Nuclear combat toe-to-toe with the Ruskies.
What's interesting in the movie is the rationality of, well, we're going to attack with a few weapons, or it turns out one got away, so we might as well go all in and use everything.
If, on the other hand, we were to immediately launch an all-out and coordinated attack on all their airfields and missile bases, we'd stand a damn good chance of catching them with their pants down. Hell, we got a 5-to-1 missile superiority as it is. We could easily assign 3 missiles to every target and still have a very effective reserve force for any other contingency.
And there is a kind of sick, crazy logic to that, and that's the problem.
The stated NATO policy and the stated U.S. policy with respect to nuclear weapons was we would initiate their use in the event of some conventional military force action by the Soviets or Warsaw Pact against the West. That would have been disaster, but that was the stated public policy. I stated we would conform to NATO policy. The presidents did, but I went to President Kennedy after I'd had time to begin to learn something about nuclear war or the risk of nuclear war, the dangers of nuclear war. And I said to the president, Mr. President, this is the U.S. stated policy. This is the stated NATO policy. Never, never, never follow that. There's no way after roughly 1960, certainly after 61, there's no way the U.S. could initiate a strike against, a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union without stimulating the Soviets to respond with a strike that would bring unacceptable damage on the U.S. And what do I mean unacceptable damage? Well, probably the killing of millions, destruction of communications. As the time went by, it got worse and worse and worse. But even early in the administration, initiation by the U.S. of a strike against the Soviets, given the fact that we had huge advantage in terms of numbers. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I remember, I thought we had a 17-to-1 numerical advantage. But at that point, and that was October 62, I did not believe, under any circumstances, we should initiate a nuclear strike against the Soviets. Because even 5 or 10 nuclear weapons targeted on the east coast of the U.S. would destroy millions, tens of millions. What U.S. president or secretary would ever have acted in a way that would yield that result? So the stated nuclear policy of the U.S. and NATO at that time was wrong, and it's wrong today.
You're talking about mass murder, General, not war.
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the breaks.
There are no acceptable losses. Look at what happened after the terrorist attacks, 9/11, 3,000 people killed. I mean, if it had only been 300 or if it had been 30,000. So I think there's no acceptable level, particularly when you're talking about civilians.
I can't conceive of acceptable losses in connection with a nuclear attack. These weapons were large weapons. We know that a very small nuclear weapon, 15 kilotons, at Hiroshima killed, as I remembered, 80,000, 85,000, something like that. These weapons, on average, were at least 20 times that in terms of destructive power. I can't conceive of any president or secretary of defense being willing to accept 100,000 or 500,000 U.S. dead in connection with any military initiative that he could avoid.
At the very end, Dr. Strangelove, excited by the idea of world destruction, rising from his wheelchair, raising his arm and saying, "Monsieur has been wrought!" At that point, Stanley cut the film.
And I think that was a wise decision.
There was a sequence after that in which the denizens of the war room, the president, his military advisors, the security people, the Russian ambassador, all engage in a custard pie fight.
Where, in other words, the whole thing had been reduced to absurdity, where the nations were fighting with the day's lunch.
Pie fights are not very funny. Although it might be funny for one person to be hit with one pie, by the time it escalates into a pie fight, it's kind of like a chase scene in a modern thriller. We've seen it done so many times that it's only a technical exercise.
And the last shot was the President of the United States and the Russian ambassador, covered in custard pies, getting patty cake, baker's man, and it was something very upsetting and sad and funny. It was a very emotional ending.
But at the end, when they put it together and had a look at it, Stanley Kubrick wasn't very happy about it, neither was Peter. They just didn't think it worked.
That would have been a right-angle diversion from the true through line of the movie, which is to the inevitable and inexorable logic of the fact that the world is going to end with this mushroom cloud and presumably with a worldwide nuclear holocaust.
And it would have stayed, except that Columbia Pictures were horrified and thought it would offend the president's family.
One of the shots showed the president being hit in the face by a cream pie. And I think it's George C. Scott who says, "Gentlemen, our beloved president has been cut down in his prime." And of course, the film had to open after the assassination of Kennedy in Dallas. So there were good reasons for not putting that sequence on at the end of the film, but the film works brilliantly.
I think Strangelove is still relevant because the basic point still applies. We have still in this world a machinery of nuclear destruction that will kill us all.
You could go through the characters in Strangelove and look at the Bush administration and say, yeah, this is this guy, this is this guy. Rumfeld's in that movie, Cheney, I mean, all those guys, you know, and sad to say, you know, we haven't evolved.
I would not relate, you know, the characters in the movie to specific, I mean, there are traits that some of them have and so forth, but anyone I have ever dealt with at the high level of national government and interviewed about this is taken it very, very seriously.
I think you could also see parallels between this film and people in the Eisenhower administration, the Johnson administration, the Kennedy administration, all administrations.
You see these powerful positions, these men, sometimes women like Mrs. Rice, that with their decision, millions of people can be killed. And you wonder, how did this idiot, how did this moron, how did this imbecile get in this position? And people die because these guys want to go to war.
Government tends to attract people like this, and one of the amazing things about Dr. Strangelove is the way that it exaggerates, but only to a degree, so that we can say, wow, there are people in government right now who are kind of like that.
The movie's a metaphor for an era that we think is over, but it's not over, because the weapons aren't gone.
I think we live in a very dangerous time now because the Non-Proliferation Agreement, Non-Proliferation Treaty, which prevented the proliferation that President Kennedy feared lay ahead, has been very successful. But now it's falling apart. North Korea has withdrawn from it. Iran seems to be moving toward a nuclear capability. It's inconceivable to me that we can deal with the North Korean problem, North Korea being almost certainly building nuclear weapons today. It's inconceivable to me we can deal with that with a military action. We must engage in diplomacy. We don't have any effective diplomatic negotiations underway. Very, very dangerous, both North Korea and Iran. If either one or both of them move ahead with nuclear weapons, others are bound to. Japan, Taiwan, the Middle East, and so on. It's an extremely dangerous world.
Historians, hundreds of years, thousands of years, if we have history that long, will look back on this and say, what kind of crazy people there were? How could they take such a risk? Life is precious. And in the name of what? Security, our way of life, protection, what is that worth in the face of some kind of annihilation?
Once you push this button, you can't unpush it, and it's too big of a button to ever be pushed.